Good evening and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. My name is Ladaris Cordell, and it is my pleasure to introduce Robert F. Kennedy Jr., author of American Values, Lessons I Learned from My Family. Robert is an environmental attorney and president of the Waterkeeper Alliance. As a resolute defender of the environment, he has worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council and Hudson Riverkeeper. Robert founded the Environmental Litigation Clinic at Pace University and also co-hosts the syndicated radio show Ring of Fire. For his contributions and environmental activism, Robert has been recognized as New York State Champion of the Environment and Time Magazine's Heroes for the Planet. Please join me in welcoming Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. Thank you so much for being here, and I know we're going to have a wonderful conversation. Robert, you are the son of Robert Francis Kennedy and Ethel Skakel Kennedy, the third of 11 siblings. And this book is what number now?
Well, I have 3 children's books, and I think I have 6 or 7 adult books.
So 10 or 11 books. This is either number 10 or number 11. In addition, you've also written a book called Framed. You wrote Crimes Against Nature about environmental issues. So American Values is the first time, however, that you have written publicly and intimately about your family. So my first questions to you are, was writing this book difficult for you? How long did it take you to write it, and why now?
I actually, there was an editor at HarperCollins who wrote it, who asked me 10 years ago, a guy called Tim Duggan, who's a very famous editor and a terrific guy, and is long gone from HarperCollins, but he asked me to write a book about, he had heard me speaking about wilderness experiences that I'd had with my father, who took us on all the great western whitewater rivers and took us mountain climbing and kayaking, etc. And he asked me to write about that, and I started the project with that in mind, but it gradually enlarged. I probably wrote 70% of the book in the first year or 2 years, and then I put it down, and I wrote 3 other books, and then HarperCollins, which had given me an advance 10 years ago, again, getting angry at me, and they told me I had to get it done, so I did. I really, I ended up writing this book for my kids. I have 7 children, and then they have, I think, 105 cousins who are the great-grandchildren of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, or great-grandchildren in some cases. And I had 29 cousins in that generation, and we were raised essentially communally at Cape Cod with the same kind of athletic regimen every day, and then eating at a different house every night. And all of the families, the 9 children of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, or 8 of the 7, the surviving 6 of the 9 had houses all in or around the same compound in a seaside village on Cape Cod called Hyannisport, and we were all raised there communally, and they all grew up, or most of them grew up in the Camelot era. So now we have all of these other kids who come every summer and are sort of part of the milieu there, and I really wanted to write something for them to tell them that there's so many books about my family, and there's a lot of good information and a tremendous amount of misinformation. And I wanted to tell them the story that in a way that allowed them to understand what really happened and really how magical it was.
So in the first two chapters, you talk about the family histories of the Skakels and the Kennedys, families that started with nothing and ended up being extremely wealthy families, maybe the wealthiest, some of the wealthiest in this country. And yet, you write, these two families were polar opposites. How so?
During the Great Depression, there were 10 millionaires in America that are known. And two of them were Irish Catholic. One was Joseph Kennedy, and the other was George Skakel, who was my mother's father. And George Skakel had been raised on a South Dakota farm, on a ranch. His father had died of alcoholism when he was 14. He had already run away from home and ridden freight trains to Chicago, and he never finished high school. But he was he was he was a risk taker, and he was a genius at metallurgy. And he figured out ways to use waste products from the coal industry and the oil industry, and ultimately he developed ways of making carbon and aluminum, and really got a monopoly on aluminum fabrication in this country at the time that the airline business was leaving the runway. And he became very wealthy, but the Skakels were carbon Republicans. They were extremely, I wouldn't say, to the extent that they thought about politics, which was not that much, except that they hated Roosevelt and they were very anti-union. And that's the only thing that my mother heard about politics. There was really no discussion. I think Herbert Hoover asked my grandfather, George Skakel, to be his treasurer. Other grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, was essentially the treasurer for Roosevelt. He was the biggest single donor to FDR. But he was very outgoing and garrulous, and he was very, he liked to be in front of the camera, and he was the first head of the SEC. He then became ambassador to England, and it was a very proud moment for him because his family had been driven 2 generations before during the Great Starvation in Ireland by the English into this country. So going back as ambassador to England was really a momentous thing for him and for our family. But they were very, very different people. My mother's, one of the things that she always talks about, and I talk about this in the book, is how strange it was for her when she started hanging out with the Kennedys, and she really walked away from her family and became a Kennedy more than any of the other in-laws. But my grandfather treated the girls in the family, like Eunice, Pat, and Jean, the same way that he treated the boys. They all got married late because he made them go to college. He put them next to him at the dinner table and made them talk about politics, and there was very organized discussion every night at dinner. And she told me that she was shocked about how the boys and girls were essentially treated the same in the Kennedy family, which was very, very different than what had happened in her family.
Right. You describe in the book about almost like chaos, the Skakel family, they didn't all sit down and have dinner together.
No, right? They rarely ate together, and they were big men. Her brothers were all 6'3", 6'4". They were fighters. They were brawlers. They all carried guns. They shot each other. They shot my mother once, and they drove cars into swimming pools, and they were a very, very wild family and very extremely entertaining family. And I talk about we had a a sea lion when I was growing up, and Sally Faye, who was the daughter of Red Fay, who was President Kennedy's, one of President Kennedy's two best friends, and here tonight, and I have to apologize because she did get a copy of the book and did not find her name in the index, and is still bitter about that. But she grew up at Hickory Hill too, right down the road from us, and was there every day. We had a sea lion living in our swimming pool that my uncle had captured off the coast of Oregon, one of the Skagels. And then he had promised for Christmas to send us Christmas seals, which we thought were the prosaic. But the crate came off a truck on Christmas morning, and there was a little baby seal in it. And he lived in our pool for 2 years. And until there were problems happened that are described in the book, and we had to get rid of them.
So you write of your parents. After my father fell for my mother, they embarked on one of the great love stories of all time. So what was it like being raised by them at your home, Hickory Hill, Virginia, a place you describe in the book as barely managed pandemonium?
Hickory Hill, and that quote actually comes from Arthur Schlesinger, who is one of my father's biographers. But it's an accurate description of my mother and father's relationship. Hickory Hill at the Cape Cod during the summertime was the summer White House. So the compound was where the government was run from, and every Friday we would hear the helicopters coming in, and all of us would assemble on the hill right above the football field, which was next to the ocean. And 3 Marine helicopters would land, and my uncles would all get off. My uncle Jack, President Kennedy, my father, who was his Attorney General, my uncle Teddy, who was in the Senate at the time, my uncle Sarge Shriver, who was running the Peace Corps, my uncle Steve Smith, who was Chief of Staff in the White House, and then Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell and some of the other kind of Irish mafia from Boston who came up on the weekends, and they raised the presidential flag on the flagpole, and the government was run from that. We had a telephone in our house that was a red phone that if you picked it up, Khrushchev would answer. It was the hotline to the Kremlin. And in the winter, we lived at Hickory Hill, which was about 7 or 8 minutes from the White House, and which was the satellite White House. And many of the great decisions, the great battles of that time were orchestrated from Hickory Hill. The integration of Ole Miss, the civil rights battles with George Wallace, the battles with the mafia, with Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana and Santos Traficante. And we would sit, and then also the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we would sit in on those discussions by the pool or in the living room and listen to them. In the meantime, the house was chaos. And Sally, I don't know if she remembers, but a time that an elephant was stampeding across the property. We had a lion, we had, the seal in the pool, and then there was, there were Green Berets who were doing maneuvers on the roof. The yard was filled with Cuban guerrillas from the Bay of Pigs invasion, and there was CIA spies and KGB spies who were, particularly one spy in particular, Georgy Bolshakov, who was a regular guest at the house, and all of these. And then there was the cultural leaders, the movie stars and the athletes and the astronauts. So every meal was 20 people, and it was constant chaos, but a wonderful, wonderful. And my mother played a big role in that. She had the horses that were galloping free in the yard, and that she would sometimes ride through the house. And It was an extraordinary time.
An understatement. So, your Uncle Jack and your father had enemies in common, lots of them. In fact, you describe in this book their administration as being under siege from a multitude of individuals. And two standouts were J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and Jimmy Hoffa. Hoover you describe as, and I quote, a poster child for abuse of power. And your father, in his job as the Attorney General, created an elite Get Hoffa squad. So how serious a threat were they?
Well, my father had been pursuing the mob for many years before he became Attorney General. And particularly, and Jimmy Hoffa, when I was a boy, and I, talk about this in the book. In fact, one of the photos in the book is me when I was, I think, 4 years old, sitting at the Rackets Committee, listening to Sam Giancana testify, and my father ridicule him because he took the fifth 105 times. And he would giggle when my father asked him whether he murdered people and stuffed them in the trunks of cars or hung them in meat hooks, and he said, "You're giggling like a little girl." And so he was at war with the mob, and Jimmy Hoffa was a creature of the mob. He was the piggy bank. The Teamsters pension fund was the piggy bank for the Chicago, North Florida, and Louisiana mob, and also for the LA mob. And so my father went to war, was at war with him for a long time. When he got into office, he launched the Get Hoffa Squad, which was really a squad that was designed to end the control of mafia, of politics, of judges, of legitimate business. He saw it as an existential threat to democracy. By the second year, he had changed and saw civil rights as the greatest threat to democracy. The failure of America to live up to its promise to be an exemplary nation and a true constitutional democracy, because a large percentage of our population was prohibited by law from participating in the basic fundamental rights like voting of democracy. So, and in both those cases, J. Edgar Hoover opposed him. J. Edgar Hoover was a terrible, terrible racist. He was also he had strong ties to the mob himself. He was a compulsive gambling addict, and he often was accepting markers from some of the big mobsters who my father was prosecuting. And there was other reasons he didn't want to admit the mafia existed. I think one of the themes of this book, which is a memoir, but it's also a history of that era, is the major tension between my father and uncle and my other members of my family and the CIA and the FBI, the two police organizations which they came to see as the biggest threat to American values. And my family really picked a fight with the CIA, with the Dulles brothers, in 1951, when my father and uncle went to Vietnam and came back convinced that America should not take on the French colonial burden. And then my uncle made a very, very famous speech in 1956. He was head of the Africa subcommittee, in which he said the Arabs should rule Arabia and the Africans should rule Africa, and we should not be telling people what kind of governments that they have. That speech made him a pariah among both liberals. Adlai Stevenson attacked him viciously, and conservatives who saw our NATO allies as the bulwark against communism and believed that our NATO allies would go broke and would not be able to defend themselves if we allowed their colonial empires to be dismantled. So that we should, although it was antithetical to American values, we should help them preserve those colonial empires. And then Dulles, of course, saw every brushfire rebellion as part of a monolithic communist attempt to take over the world. My uncle and father were pitted against them in many, many different ways during their presidency. And of course, in 1961, the Bay of Pigs, 2 months into his administration, the United States launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was what Nixon called his brainchild. He had done all the planning for it as vice president. But they waited till President Kennedy was in office to actually launch it. And he realized at that time he'd been tricked by the CIA, he'd been lied to. He said on the afternoon of the invasion, he said to Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, I want to take the CIA, crush it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter it to the wind. And he fired Dulles, who was iconic, basically founder of the agency. He fired Bissell and Cabell. And the war between our family and the CIA continues even to this day. But, through the late 60s and the 70s, it was, the CIA actually had an agent or an officer named Sam Halpern, whose job was to contaminate the Kennedy family name and he launched an entire industry, a book industry about our family. Many of the kind of scandalous slanders you hear about our family that are now embedded in the political consciousness of this nation, that Joseph Kennedy, my grandfather, was a bootlegger. It's a wonderful story. It's not true. But that was a CIA story. The Kennedys fixed the Chicago election with using their old relationships with mobsters. Again, this was one of Sam Halpern's inventions. The Kennedys were involved in the Castro assassinations and many, many other of these stories, which I show in the book, were not and could not have been true and can be proven to not be true, but they were part of this kind of battle between the CIA and my family.
You describe JFK's foreign policy approach in your book as show other nations the warm heart and clear conscience of America. That was his policy, his approach to foreign policy. Show other nations the warm heart and clear conscience of America. So how does that approach compare with that of President Obama and of President Trump?
Well, my grandfather actually was the one who believed very, very strongly that America should model democracy, but we should never impose it. And that he believed, and he said this repeatedly, that imperialism abroad was inconsistent with democracy at home. And that if we became an imperial nation, we would become, by necessity, a police state, a national security state, a militarized garrison state at home. And we would lose our civil rights in the process, and we would lose the things that made America a unique and exemplary nation. And he was, of course, right about that. We can see the evolution of that. But his sons believe the same thing. My uncle said many times to his advisors that he didn't care if Castro wanted to experiment with communism in Cuba. He just didn't want Russians in Cuba. He didn't want it to become a platform for Soviet expansion in this hemisphere. But people ought to experiment with different economic forms in whatever nation they were. And he gave many examples of his willingness to deal with communism. Communists like Tito and Sekou Touré in Guinea, who were avowedly Marxists, but who were independent of the Kremlin. And he thought America should support those kind of leaders, and that if communism didn't work, it would collapse under its own weight. That we shouldn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, because that would destroy America in the long run. And you ask about what the difference is with Trump, and this is not an anti-Trump book, But I think, the worst thing about Trump's foreign policy is that he's not only discredited America in the eyes of the world, but he's discredited the entire experiment with self-government. And I do a lot of business in China, and if you go to China and talk to even lower tier leaders there, like the deputies or governors of the various provinces, these are the people, the smartest people in the country. These are the kids, the 180 IQ kids who scored top on their tests. They're smart, they're well-informed, they speak numbers of languages, they've read books, and they're profound thinkers and very, very smart and thoughtful and wonderful to talk to. Oh, if you're living in that nation, if you're living in China, and you're looking at what's happened in America, what's happening here today, why would you ever think to yourself, that's a great system of government that can produce, that kind of buffoonery as national leadership of, a series of presidents, not just Trump, but a series of presidents who literally have not read a book, and who aren't thoughtful people, and who aren't really trying to solve a problem, but are governing using these alchemies of demagoguery. And so I think the only way in the future that we are going to be able, the American experiment with democracy worked. We were the only democracy on earth in 1780. 1865, by the Civil War, there were 6 democracies. At the time my father died, there were 160, and all of them were modeled on the American experiment. I don't see why today anybody would look at our country and say, we want what they have. People are going other directions, and it's something that I don't think most people think about that impact that he's had. It's something to me that's very, very sad for our country.
In your book, you have a wonderful story about the first time you met Barack Obama. Can you just give us a brief?
I was, my whole family was really focused on what was happening in Africa and very, very excited about it as the map of Africa changed and, the colonial nations withdrew. My uncle was head of the African subcommittee and loved what was happening in Africa, that all that democracy was getting a foothold and replacing colonialism. And my father, when I was 7 years old, brought home a 16-millimeter film called Africa Speaks and showed it on a little screen in our basement. And I became obsessed with Africa after that. And then I would wait for National Geographic to arrive. I would wait for Life magazine to arrive so I could look at the pictures. And then in 1960, an African group showed up at our house on the Cape, and it was, for me, the most exciting thing that I'd ever encountered, which I get to meet these real African leaders. And one of them was a man named Tom Mboya, who was a Kenyan labor leader who had been one of the co-leaders of the Mau Mau, which was the revolution that drove the British out. The leader, the titular leader who had gone to jail was Jomo Kenyatta, who was Kikuyu. Tom Mboya was a Luau, which is the smallest tribe in Kenya. And they're a fish-eating tribe from up at Lake Victoria, and they're known as peacemakers and very, very smart people. And he had and the British had said to Uncle in 1959 and said, we're going to hand the country over to you of Kenya in 5 years, in 64. So you have 5 years to prepare yourself. And Mboya, who had 1 year at Oxford, had looked around and said, there's not a single black African in Kenya who has a college degree. How are we going to run this country? He had written letters to all the U.S. colleges and gotten commitments from 200 of them, including Harvard, to give a scholarship to one Kenyan kid who Mboya would choose. He was going to choose the smartest 200 kids in the country and give them a full scholarship. But he realized in the summer of 1960, during the U.S. presidential election, that he had no money to transport the kids here. So he took a special trip from Nairobi to the US State Department to beg them to give money to pay for these kids. But Nixon was running for vice president and believed that if they paid for 200 Africans to come over, it would hurt him in the southern states, which were then up for grabs. And so he refused. And Mboya went to Martin Luther King, and King said, "You should go see John Kennedy." And he introduced him to Harry Belafonte, who was close friends with my family, who was funding the civil rights movement at that time, the Calypso singer. And he brought Mboya up to meet my uncle. My uncle was so impressed with him that he wrote a personal check for $200,000 for Mboya to bring these kids over here. But on the proviso, and Mboya never tell anybody who had given him the money, because he felt it would be used against him in the South. Nixon found out about it and then broadcasted it and called it the Kennedy Airlift to make it sound like it was something bad. So in 1964, I finally got my dream come true that I went to Africa with my uncle Sergeant Driver, who was head of the Peace Corps, and his son Bobby. We went for 5 weeks, and we spent a lot of time with Tom Mboya. And in '68, my father was killed in June 6th, and my mother had 11 kids. All of the older kids were dispersed so that she could kind of get a handle on the house and figure out what was happening, how to take care of these little children. My brother Joe went to work as a guide on Mount Rainier for Jim Whittaker. My brother David went to work for Cesar Chavez in Arizona or in Delano, California. My sister Kathleen went to work for the Inuit in Alaska. And I got sent to Africa for 3 months, and I spent a lot of that time with Tom Mboya. I left in August. The following September, he was next in line for the presidency after Kenyatta, who I also got to meet. But in September, Mboya was assassinated by thugs working for Daniel Arap Moi, who was a crony of Kenyatta's and who later became the dictator. In 2004, I was living with Larry David, the second year in a row in Martha's Vineyard. And at that time, he was still writing Seinfeld. And I was asked by the Democratic Party to give the keynote speech on the environment at the convention in Boston. And Larry wanted to go up, so we both flew up together in his plane. And we got floor passes, and we had a great time. We spent the day on the floor of the convention. I gave my speech. And after I spoke, this young senator from Illinois who nobody had ever heard of, he'd only been in office for a little over a year, Barack Obama, spoke and gave this dazzling speech, which propelled him 4 years later to the Democratic nomination. And we got to sit with him in the green room, and he told us that he was going back he was going to Martha's Vineyard to raise money in Oak Bluff after the convention, and we said, "We'll give you a ride down." And then we had dinner with him that night, and I sat next to him at dinner and talked to him for a long time. And I asked him about his family, about which I knew nothing. And he told me that his father was from Kenya. And I said to him, "What tribe was he from, do you know?" And he said, "Yeah, he was from the Luau tribe." And I said, "Oh, have you ever heard of Tom Mboya?" And he said, "Tom Mboya is the reason I'm in this country, because my father was the first kid brought over on the airlift."
So there are...
And Larry introduced me to my wife, Cheryl Hines,
Right.
who plays his wife on the show. Right. At that time, he didn't know her, but that was maybe 10 years later.
So I have to tell you, I've read this book, and there are so many wonderful gems of stories just like that throughout the book. It's a terrific read. All right, so 1963, your Uncle Jack was assassinated. You were 9 years old. I found your description of that tragedy and its aftermath to be riveting and really painful. But in the book, you write about Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA. Allen Dulles told a young writer in 1965, that little SOB Kennedy, he thought he was a god. You continue in the book, LBJ would later appoint Dulles to the Warren Commission, investigating Jack's assassination, a curious choice at a time when some Americans, including my father, suspected the CIA's involvement in JFK's murder. Now, in your book, you seem to be pretty clear about who was involved in JFK's killing. Who? I mean, was this a conspiracy?
I don't think I am clear about it, but I think that Dulles was a strange choice, and Dulles kind of wheedled his way onto the Warren Commission, and we now know that he was working with the head of plans at the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, who was essentially the head of clandestine services, to conceal the relationship, to conceal the CIA's relationship, particularly their relationship with Oswald. And Oswald had worked for the CIA for many years in the counterintelligence unit, and that's very well established. The Warren Commission, of course, found that there was no conspiracy in a single shooter, and it was a political decision at the time because LBJ believed at that time that what Hoover was telling him and what Dulles was telling him, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald was a toady of Castro, and LBJ was terrified that if that were proven, it would require him to go to war with Castro, and that would be the end of the world. Oh, he wanted a finding that a single shooter did it, and he could go on with the ambitious plans for his administration and not make this a world crisis. And that's what happened. Now, the Congress then in the 70s reinvestigated, and they had a great deal more information available, and they were able to get it into the CIA, although the CIA, which it admits today, was still manipulating information and still won't hand over information. But the U.S. Congress, the House Committee on Assassinations, after almost a 3-year investigation, found that my uncle's assassination was the result of a conspiracy and that there were multiple shooters. They don't say who. That's, they spent a lot of time looking at it, and the evidence, if you read it, which I have, is pretty clear.
So you were 14 when your father was murdered in Los Angeles in 1968, 50 years ago next week. Your dad was 42, your mother was 38, and she was pregnant with child number 11, your sister Rory, right? So I will tell you, when I read of your experience and your family's experience of this, I was absolutely moved to tears, and I'm old and jaded. It takes a lot to move me to tears, and it really did. And you write, my father was fatalistic about his own destiny. I just watched the Netflix just released documentary called Robert Kennedy for President. And in that documentary, it suggests that there's been a cover-up about who it was that was responsible for your father's death. Do you think that your father's death was the continuation of the conspiracy that was responsible for your uncle's death?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, what I would say about my father's death is that that there was that Sirhan, whatever his motives were, according to Noguchi's autopsy, none of Sirhan's bullets hurt my father. The 4 shots that killed my father came from behind, and they were contact shots.
Right up against the...
In other words, the gun was actually touching his body.
Right.
And Noguchi, who performed what is called the perfect autopsy in the literature, he didn't want to happen to my father's autopsy what had happened in Dallas, which was, an endless controversy. So he flew in, I think, 10 of the most important coroners in the country, including one, the top coroner from each of the armed services, to observe his autopsy. And he did everything by the book. And Noguchi, did not believe that Sirhan killed my father. And the bullets that were recovered from my father did not match Sirhan's gun. And there were 13 bullets accounted for. And Sirhan's gun only carried 8 bullets. So in terms of who would be responsible, I would not venture to say. I don't know. There's a lot more information, and people, a lot of people have very strong opinions. And I grew up assuming that President Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy, because even when I was a little kid, when I was a little boy, I was in the White House when LBJ came in and told us all, we were next to my uncle's casket. LBJ came into the White House and told us that Lee Harvey Oswald had been killed. And I said to my parents, why did he kill him? Did he love our family? And nobody ever answered that question, and it made no sense to me. And then my father later, recovered Ruby's phone records, and it was basically a litany of everybody that he had indicted over the past 10 years. And the racketeering committee, it was, people who were involved with the mob. So it never made any sense to me that, I don't know who killed my uncle. It doesn't make any sense to me, never did, that there was a single shooter, but I always assumed that Sirhan killed my father. And then Paul Schrade, who was one of my father's closest friends, who was the third in command of the UAW, and a very important figure. He was the one who recruited Cesar Chavez to the labor movement, and a very, very, very dear, close friend of my father, and who was shot at the same time as my father. He was shot by the first of Sirhan's bullets. He hit Paul Schrade in the head. And Paul Schrade has spent the last 10 years of his life trying to get a reinvestigation, because he believes that Sirhan did not kill my father. And he forced me essentially to sit down and read the autopsy report, which I did not want to do, and to look at the other evidence. And at this point, I say that if you have a rational mind, if you can count, if you believe that an 8-chamber revolver cannot shoot 13 shots, then you have to believe there was somebody else involved.
The last chapter in American Values, you titled Mother, and you write about your mother. I'm quoting you, her main racket was cranking out babies. So you write she bore 11 children, she had 5 C-sections, and she was pregnant 99 months. So no wonder you start off the chapter, though she be little, she is fierce. And you also write, I seem to have been at odds with my mother since birth. I love your description of your mother and her many escapades. So I'd like you to tell us about her, but then why you were at odds with her and how that manifested itself, and then what's your relationship with her now?
I had a very rebellious spirit, and we had a very, very tumultuous relationship when I was younger. And and now I have a wonderful relationship with my mother, and this book is really kind of an homage to her, and in fact, it's dedicated to her. I don't know, John Bradshaw says that you have to divorce your parents. And I understand what that means, because so many times our relationship with our parents are fraught with expectations. and expectations are kind of, resentments in waiting. And
And expectations on both sides,
yeah,
right?
but
Right?
if you, because if you expect somebody to behave a certain way and they don't, then you spend a lot of time focused on your anger at them. And, I got a divorce in my first marriage, and the day after I got a divorce, I became best friends with my wife because I had no longer had any expectations that she would behave in the way that I expected her to. And I think people do have to do that with their parents, and it's part of growing up is that. And, when I got sober, I was addicted for drugs for several years. And when I got sober and reconnected with my mother, I connected with her on that basis, and I was able to see, really clearly for the first time these extraordinary gifts that she had given me and my brothers and sisters, and her athleticism, her competitivism, her this very bizarre kind of combination she has of piety and irreverence, and her humor and her love of good raconteurship of storytelling, and the way that she just gets everybody to participate, that she's fearless and courageous, and and that she believes in things, and she will go, she'll die with her boots on. If she believes in something, she'll never back down. Nothing can make her back down. So, and then I also had 7 kids of my own, and I began thinking about how did she get the 11 of us to go to daily mass at 7 before school, and then go horseback riding for an hour before school every morning. And then how did she get us all to show up on time at meals with our hair brushed and our fingernails clean? And how did she, she was very disciplined about making sure that at every dinner table there was a single conversation, and that sidebar conversations were forbidden, that everybody had to participate. And she'd have famous people there, Supreme Court justices and, and movie stars and comedians, etc. And she'd encourage them to talk and ask them questions, but then she'd make sure that all of us participated too. And I think about that and the challenges of raising my own kids and getting them to do those things. And I have no idea, I'm just filled with admiration for her and a lot of gratitude.
You have some terrific stories in there about your mom. Do you remember the one, if you could tell us about when she went to court? Didn't she get is this the one with the traffic ticket? Or there was
One of the times she went to court was when my father was Attorney General. We would ride every morning very early, and we would ride through the CIA. The CIA was only half a mile from our house, and we would ride through the CIA compound, and then we would end up in this little ramshackle farm that was owned by a man named Mr. Zemo. And I actually liked Zemo because he had started me racing homing pigeons when I was 7, and I was grateful to him. And but he had fighting cocks, and he had fighting dogs, and then he had a horse that was filled with, he had a barn that was filled with horses, and we heard this very baleful whinnying from the horses. My mother had me and my brother Joe break into the barn. There was 9 of us kids on horseback, and we found all these horses that were starving to death. Their feathers were cut from holes in the floor, and it looked like he was deliberately torturing them. And my mother had us steal all the horses, and we brought them back to our house, and we and fed them. One of them died of colic that night, and the rest of them, the vet came when we were going off to school and saved them. But Mr. Zemo sued her, and he in turn was sued by the ASPCA, and that circus which was highly publicized, lasted for 2 years. And in the end, I think the jury deliberated for 4.5 hours and then came back and let her off the hook. But it was a very funny time, and the press asked my father, about what he thought, and he said, "I don't know what to think. If you figure out what she's up to, please let me know."
It's great stuff. It's great stuff. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. So who was the most influential in stimulating your environmental interests?
I think probably my dad was. He was, first of all, one of the ways that he kind of re-engaged after the death of his brother, which left him shattered. My mother said that he was like a man who had lost all of his limbs. He was really in a twilight world for months afterward, and really disengaged. And one of the ways that he re-engaged was in nature. He read the Greeks. He leaned on his Catholicism a lot, but he began reading the existential writers, and he read the Greeks, and and Greek poets and Camus, but he also went into nature, and he found solace there in those kind of struggles, and so we began doing a lot of mountain climbing. We began doing whitewater rivers, and he always encouraged me. I was interested in the outdoors from when I was a little boy, and I began breeding and racing Hungarian homing pigeons when I was 7 years old, and did it very seriously. And then he got me my first. I became obsessed with falconry. I read a book by T.H. White about Camelot because it was Camelot. So I read a book, and T.H. White, the British author, had been a falconer, and there was a beautiful chapter on King Arthur as a young boy training his first hawk. And I read that, and I knew I wanted to be a falconer. And there was a guy who lived near us, who was an engineer who designed jets for the Pentagon, and he was a very famous falconer. And my father knew about him because whenever Arab dignitaries were visiting Washington, they would send him over because the Arabs are crazy for falconry. And he lived only a mile from my home, and I apprenticed under him when I was 9. I became a master falconer, and then I ended up flying hawks for my whole life. I fly them till today. And I wrote the exam that people take to become a falconer now, and I've been involved in that sport all my life. But my father, I did very poorly in school. I think I would have been diagnosed as ADHD when I was a kid. But they didn't do that then. But I love nature. And my father, I think he did something, because I think I would have been crushed if he had expressed his disappointment in me because of my grades. He always gave me very positive reinforcements about the things that I did well, which was, handling these animals and training hawks and stuff. So I think that was important to me.
Is there anything that you wish you could have said to your dad that you didn't?
I say it in the book. I don't have any regrets about my relationship with my father, and I think, he was a very compassionate and understanding person, and so I don't have those kind of regrets. That's not to say I don't have a lot of regrets, because I do. There's a lot of things that I did wrong that I wish I could go back, but that's not one of them.
Right. How did your parents meet?
They met on Mount Tremblant in Canada, and my aunt Jean Smith was roommates with my mother at Manhattanville College. It was a Catholic college in New York, and on the Connecticut border. And they had conspired to get their families together. And the way they did it was on this ski trip. And that's where my father and my mother first met.
So what were your best memories growing up as a Kennedy? You have any one favorite?
I mean, I guess my best memories were from Cape Cod, which to me is the happiest place in the world, and then doing all of those wilderness trips with my dad. I would say those are my, being in the water, being under the water, and just, the life that we had at the Cape was amazing. My grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, would take us horseback riding in the summers. He would take us horseback riding every morning, and then we'd go to church. And those rides, he had a very big place in the center of Cape Cod that had kettle ponds in it, and we would swim the horses across the ponds, and there would be, 15 cousins in a line behind him, all on horses through these very, very beautiful sandy lanes that crisscross the scrub pine forest on the Cape, and you felt like you were in a wilderness. And he was very, he was a very loving man. He talked to his horse all the time. He had a horse called Shillelagh that was very spooky that he had imported from Ireland. And it was a hunter, but I think it had thoroughbred in it because it was very nervous. And he talked to it all the time, and he would talk about politics and the economy. My parents said it was the smartest horse in the country.
So I'm going to ask you about another book. You wrote the book Framed. It was published in 2016. It's about the murder of 15-year-old Martha Moxley in 1975 and the conviction of Michael Skakel, your cousin. And in your book, you wrote the murder, the conviction you believe was unjust. So just recently, very recently, the Connecticut Supreme Court reversed his conviction. And one of the justices, Carmen Espinosa, wrote a dissenting opinion and wrote in part, quote, "Other convicted criminals would undoubtedly be thrilled to receive such special treatment. The vast majority do not share the petitioner's financial resources, social standing, ethnicity, or connections to a political dynasty." So in other words, she's saying this was a case of white male privilege beating the criminal justice system. What do you say?
Well, I would say that anybody who read my book would see that it was the opposite. And Michael Skakel would never, ever have been convicted if it weren't for the fact that the press could link him to my family. Michael Skakel's not a Kennedy cousin. He is a cousin of the Kennedys, but I didn't know Michael Skakel growing up, and I met him really when I got sober. He's been sober for 35 years, despite spending 11 or 12 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was never a suspect in the crime. The girl who was killed tragically was his closest friend. And Michael was 11 miles away with 5 eyewitnesses when the crime was committed, and that's why the court finally got rid of his conviction. Incidentally, and I spent time writing this book. If Michael Skakel had been guilty of that crime, or if I even suspected he might be, I would have turned him in if I thought he was. I wouldn't defend him because he's my cousin. And our relationship, in fact, when we wrote the book, was estranged. But I knew he had been falsely convicted. And I saw it happening like a slow train wreck, exactly how it happened, that the press got this, that they got into a frenzy that twisted the whole system because they were able to say he was a Kennedy cousin, and there's no way in the world that he ever could have committed the crime. And he had an airtight alibi. He had multiple witnesses the alibi. He had the misfortune of having the best or the worst lawyer in Connecticut. But it's black letter law in every state in this country that if a defendant is convicted of a crime, and there's an alibi witness, and the lawyer fails to even call that alibi witness and question him, that it is per se malpractice, and it's an automatic revocation of the sentence. And in fact, the Supreme Court justices who decided this case goaded this dissenting judge, saying, show us a single case where a failure to call an alibi witness did not result in the overturning of the sentence. Michael got the same kind of justice, the justice that he should have gotten at the outset. He was, incidentally, he was convicted of a crime that he was never a suspect for 27 years. Mark Furman and Dominic Dunn made him a suspect for their own economic interests 27 years after the murder was committed. Michael had never been a suspect before that. And during the course of investigating this for this book, I came upon a man whose name is Tony Bryant. He is the first cousin of Kobe Bryant, the basketball player. And I heard from other people that he was part of a group that actually killed Martha Moxley. And I found his number and called him. And he said to me, I've been waiting 27 years for this phone call. And then he gave me a full confession. And he said he and two other boys named Adolph and Burr went up that night, planned to kill Martha. On the way up, they took the train up from the city. Tony got cold feet and left when he realized they were actually going to kill her. They got golf clubs in the Schuylkill yard. They were seen by other people, and that they confessed repeatedly to murdering her. Now, anybody who has any doubts about that can go on YouTube and look up Tony Bryant and see his confession, because we convinced him to confess, repeat the conviction or the confession on videotape. So now, the Connecticut police have refused in every way to investigate his claims. And the three boys have now taken the fifth. Tony Bryant said, I will tell everything that happened if you give me immunity. He doesn't want to be convicted. He's a black kid. And his mother for 25 years has been telling him to keep his mouth shut because he's a black kid in a white neighborhood, and it was a little white girl who got killed, and he'll end up in jail for the crime that his friends committed. I called his friends up, and I said, did you know Martha Moxley? And they said yes. And I said, were you there that night? And they said yes. And I have that on tape. Those tapes were ruled admissible by the lower court, and Tony's videotape was ruled admissible. So Michael Schuylkill now, the state now has to decide to retry him. But they now have a decision from the Supreme Court of Connecticut saying he had an alibi from a psychiatrist, a man today who's a very famous restaurateur and psychiatrist who has no relationship with the Schuylkill family, and remembers being with Michael that night watching the American premiere of Monty Python's Flying Circus. That's why he and his four cousins drove 11 miles away to watch this on TV at the time at 8 o'clock, and they didn't get back till midnight. And Martha was murdered at 10. And so there's no way that he could have committed the crime. And I know Michael, so I knew he didn't commit it even before I knew the evidence. And now you have kids who actually say they did murder her, who would take the fifth in front of a jury. So there's no way in the world a jury will ever convict them because, of course, even if you don't believe, if you don't know what happened, that's reasonable doubt. And, Michael should never have been convicted, and he wouldn't have been convicted if it weren't for his relationship to my family.
Well, we have now come to the conclusion of our conversation, and I have one request to make of you. Usually there's a final question, and instead of that, I found the last couple sentences of your book to be so inspiring. So if it's all right with you, would you just close our program by reading them? And I've written them out right here, if you hold that.
know what
And
they
it's
are.
number 3, right there. If you just read that. And this closes the book. Need those glasses. Right there.
So long as any American is suffering from poverty or injustice, the American experience is diminished for all of us. Both our faith and our national heritage require us to fight for the poor, even if we're going to lose, and even if it means breaking the law. And in these moral adventures, we should never relent. Quote, Kennedys never give up. End quote, our mother chided us. We have to die with our boots on.
Thank you. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this evening's program brought to you by the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley. We thank Robert F. Kennedy Jr., author of American Values, Lessons I Learned from My Family, our audience here in Palo Alto, and those of you joining us on the radio and the web. And now, this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, celebrating over 115 years of enlightened discussion, is adjourned. Thank you all.